I want to encourage you this morning, if you don't have a Bible, there's some free Bibles out in our foyer. There are hardback copies underneath the two tables out there. You can grab one of those. And if you don't have a Bible, you can take that with you as you go. That's our gift to you. And we'd love to be able to do that for you. We're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18 through 25, that scripture that the ladies just read for us. It was the Roman politician Cicero who said that the main task of philosophy is to teach us how to face our death and to teach us how to face suffering. And he concluded that your life is on loan from nature that can be recalled at any time. So it's wisdom to agree with the terms of the loan because that's really the only choice that you have. One man said, he described ancient philosophy as requiring one to become your own physician. And it led to Western philosophy, has now been termed an avenue to save your skin from death and from suffering. Seneca was a Roman. He wrote a really famous book on dealing with death and suffering. It's called To Marcia on Consolation. And in this book, Marcia had lost her son. She died 3 years ago, and she was terribly grieved by the death of her son. Still grieving 3 years later. Seneca remark to Marcia was, overcome your grief and move on. Death and suffering is just the nature of things. Perhaps no ancient philosophical school is as well known as the Stoics. And the Stoics said that the task of the mind is to think and align yourself with the orderliness of the world. All right, I'm a great Stoic because I love order and cleanliness in my life. The task of the mind is to think and align yourself with the orderliness of the world. And Keller said Stoics learn to face suffering in one of three ways. Number one, you accept the unexpected twists and turn of fate as simply the providence of God and deal with it. Number two, you give reason preeminence over any of your feelings, and you learn to detach yourself from loving anything too much. And number three, the Stoics would say death is a transformation from one state into another. And so at the time of death, the universe has a different task for you, different responsibility. And so you just move on. And while these thoughts were being formulated, they really gave us the bedrock and the foundation for Western philosophy. Almost the exact same thing was happening in the East, but it goes by completely different names. One of the most famous Eastern religions is Hinduism. And Hinduism believes that the material world and the individual human beings that exist in it are simply an illusion. Their famous cry, their motto of Hinduism is, "Thou art that." And so whatever you come across is just another aspect of an illusion, of some different reality of being. Not only is the material world an illusion, the Hindus would say, but so is the individual, so is evil an illusion, and so is good an illusion. Nothing exists outside of the one all-soul, this absolute spirit. And so in other words, you can suffer. And you can make it through suffering because really you can't lose anything in Hinduism. Buddhism started with the story of a prince. And this prince lived in luxury and wealth. And one day this luxurious, wealthy prince decided to go outside of his palace. And he observed what came to be called the four distressing sights. And the four distressing sights were four men. A sick man, a poor man, a dead man, and an old man. And as a result of seeing the four distressing sights, the prince gave his life to finding peace and harmony in the midst of suffering and chaos. And under a tree, the story goes, he achieved enlightenment. And he came out with the four noble truths of Buddhism. Number one, all life is suffering. Number two, suffering is caused by desires or cravings. Number three, suffering will only end when your desires and your cravings end. Number four, the only way that that's going to happen is through the eightfold path to enlightenment. What's really interesting is that Western philosophy's concepts about suffering and death and dealing with it are very similar to Eastern concepts of suffering and death and dealing with it. Keller puts it this way, put in simple language, if you can see that everything is impermanent, we won't be attracted to it. And so the one universal, accepted, maybe the answer to suffering, don't love anything too much, and you'll be able to endure. Fast forward to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is one of my favorite guys to study, one of the greatest minds of our time. Obviously, if you have an iPhone or a Macintosh computer that never gets a virus ever on the planet, then you know a little bit about Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs said this, I like to think that something survives after you die. It's strange to think you accumulate all this experience, maybe a little wisdom, and it just goes away. I really want to believe that something survives. Maybe your conscience endures, but on the other hand, maybe it's just like an on and off switch. Click, and you're gone. In other words, it doesn't matter if you suffer, if you don't suffer. One day, it's all going to be over anyway, and you'll be gone. Charles Taylor describes our secular world as embracing what he terms an exclusive humanism. Exclusive humanism is a new option on the marketplace of beliefs, and it's a vision in which anything beyond the immanent, anything beyond you in your feelings is eclipsed. It doesn't really matter. And so ultimately, everything that matters is just what's going on in you, in your feelings. And as a result of this, today people have dealt with death and suffering in a variety of ways, but they all come down to one center. Suffering is something to be avoided at all costs. Suffering is an interruption. It's this evil hiccup that we have in life, and we've got to figure out how to get over it or ignore it or get through it. Suffering, the need in suffering is to figure out what's causing the pain and work around it, eliminate it. Everything in every situation has a hidden side exit somewhere. There's an easy button. You just got to find it on the wall somewhere and push it. Or, hey, at the end of the day, we're all just going to die anyway. So you might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The question this morning is this: what does the Bible say about suffering? Do we go along with the East and say that, you know what, all this is just an illusion, and so we'll stomach it, we'll come into a new reality at some point in time? Do we adopt the Western philosophy that death and suffering is just the nature of things? Don't think about it. Educate, medicate, do whatever you can to work around it. 1 Peter in the New Testament is the book on suffering. And I want to look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18 through 25 this morning. And Peter's going to give us three admonitions, three ideas for dealing with suffering as we come across it in our individual lives. Number one, he's going to tell us this: endure suffering, don't avert it. Endure, don't avert. Number two, improve, don't abandon. Suffering will call us to improve our theology of God, not to abandon the truth that we know exists about God. And number three, press in, don't push away. Number one, endure, don't avert. Number two, improve, don't abandon. And number three, press in, don't push away. Suffering, perhaps more than anything else in life, will reveal what you really think about God. And C.S. Lewis gives us a great admonition. He says, you never know how much you really believe anything until the truth or its falsehood becomes a matter of life and death to you. Number one in your outline, and number one this morning, endure suffering. Don't avert it. Look at verse 18, 1 Peter chapter 2. If you have the right Bible, you're on page 2095. Verse 18, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. And before we get into details about suffering, I want you to notice who Peter is addressing here. The first word in all of translations should say something like slaves or servants. But this isn't the typical word, the most used word for slave or servant in the New Testament. This word for servant means household slave. And they are very low on the social ladder. Just 2 verses above this, verse 16, will give us a little bit more as we understand what the slave, who he's addressing here. Verse 16, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Now, servant in verse 16 is different than servant in verse 18. But Peter is merging these two concepts ultimately in one. And he's making this passage applicable to every single one of us. And I want you to see how this is going to work. Here's the item that very few commentators, very few people address when they're dealing with 1 Peter chapter 2 in verse 18. Most people in the first century didn't consider a slave a full person. A slave was half a human, or less than that. They weren't fully human in every respect of the word. Aristotle said injustice could never be done to a slave because a slave was mere property. And people who aren't considered totally a person don't have moral demands placed on them. And so right at the beginning of this passage in 1 Peter, Peter does something that is indescribable. It's totally contrary to the culture in which he's writing. And he says, in the family of God, every single person, from the lowliest of slaves to the highest of status, is made in the image of God. And they give allegiance to the God in whose image they have been created. And so, no, it's not just black lives that matter. It's Asian lives that matter. It's white lives that matter. It's Mexican. It's Hispanics. It's every single life on the planet matters to God. And so here's what the text says. It says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect. And you've got two options of how you can translate this verse in verse 18. And it all revolves around this phrase, with all respect or with all fear. Option one, we can translate verse 18, servants with all fear, be subject to your masters. Or option two, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear. Now, option two would seem to say servants are to fear their masters. With all fear, be subject to your masters. But option one carries over from verse 17. Look back to verse 17. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God. The word order is extremely important. Actually, the word order in Greek is different than the word order that most of us have in our English translations. Fear is used 6 times in the book of 1 Peter. And every time the word fear is used, it is used of fearing God, not man. It is very specific command and admonition to us that we do not fear men as we walk on this planet, but we fear one person, we fear God. Peter never says to fear people. Fear is always directed to God. Therefore, when God calls us to submit to an abusive boss, a crooked politician, even maybe a sinful husband, the command is not bound to the authority of the person we are submitting to. The command is bound to the authority of God who gave us the command in the first place. We can submit to unruly masters because ultimately we are submitting to God, who put that person in the role that he is functioning in. At our last ministry job, we were in a horrendous experience. I hope none of you have to go through something like this, but we went through a church split, the job that we came out of. I was there for 9 months, almost 6 months into the job, there was a church split. And as part of this church split process, in order to mediate what was going on, the church leaders decided to hire a consultant, a mediator, to come in and try to keep this thing together, to keep it from not getting too crazy on the conflict side, but using it as a chance for restoration and reconciliation among all parties. And so he came in and he reached out to all the leaders in the church, to the pastors on staff, and to the key players that were part of this conflict. And he sent out a list of about 6 questions. And so we all answered those 6 questions, and we got it back to this church consultant. And about a week later, after I filled out my form, he called me, and we had about a 45-minute, maybe an hour discussion. And he's going through every question that we talked about. You know, what do you think the main problem is? What do you think the solution to the problem is? What have you contributed to the problem? That was a really good question that hit me right between the eyes. And so we talked about it, and we go through this whole dialogue. And at the end of the conversation, I don't remember exactly what he said to me, but he said something to the effect of, Jared, I mean, these are tough times for any church to go through a church split. It's really a difficult time. But I want to leave you with a verse, and I want you just to think about this verse. He said, have you ever read or do you know what 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18 says? And I said, not off the top of my head, probably something about suffering. And he's like, yeah, it says something about suffering. He said, I want you to think about this verse. I want you to pray about this verse every time this conflict comes into your mind. And he read 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18 to me. He said, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust." Last point from the text out of verse 18 before we move on. Peter places masters into two categories. There are bosses, there are people who have superiority, who have a high status in culture. There are bosses who are good and gentle, and there are bosses who are unjust. And that word for unjust is skolios in the Greek. It's where we get our word scoliosis from. And God is calling us in 1 Peter chapter 2 to submit to crooked masters, not only to those who are good and gentle, but to the ones who are crooked. And I've heard this statement from a number of people a number of times, and many of us have friends that have heard these statements. I'm a son, and I can't submit to my father-in-law. I can't do it. I can't stand the guy. He is unruly. He does things that I would never fathom doing. I can't believe I've got to submit to this guy. I've got this boss. He's a micromanager. He's a control freak. I got to get out of here. I got to find a new job. This is the only way that I can deal with this situation. This crooked politician, you're going to call me to submit to this guy or this woman? There's no way I can do this. Listen, people are never the issue in submitting to those in authority. The issue is, are you willing to fear God above men and submit to his sovereignty? The world will tell you to handle suffering in unjust masters and bosses and government officials like JFK handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like Jack Bauer handled diplomacy, like Aaron Rodgers handled the Cincinnati Bengals 2 weeks ago. Crisis averted. Get out of there. Avert the crisis at any possible chance. God tells you don't avert suffering, endure suffering. One man has said this, it has really stuck with me. God will not protect you from what he will perfect you through. Gary Thomas wrote in his book, Sacred Marriage, he says, and I've shared this quote with you before, "Our Lord has sovereignly ordained that our refining process take place as we go through suffering, not around it." And so, number one, how do we deal with suffering? We endure. We don't avert. Number two, we improve through suffering. We don't abandon. And what I mean by that is we improve our theology. We improve our understanding of who we are, of ultimately who God is, and we don't abandon our faith. Right? And so last week we saw the worst shooting in U.S. soil since the founding of our nation took place in Las Vegas. And the response, you watch TV, it won't be anything close to 9/11 when innocent people have suffered unjustly. The response will be almost the exact opposite. After 9/11, the churches were packed. The weekends after that, 2-3 weeks after 9/11, people were coming in the church doors in the hordes. They were doing this. But instead, this year, you're going to see something like this happen. I could never believe in a God who would allow suffering of innocent people like that. Instead, people are not going to turn to the church and turn to God for support through suffering. They're actually going to turn away, and they're going to try to reason an atheistic kind of God is not even real sort of defense. And most intellectuals who hold this position will argue that God cannot be all-powerful. If God allows innocent people to suffer, like we saw in Las Vegas, he cannot be all-powerful. Otherwise, he wouldn't never allow it in the first place. And so some people abandon the biblical view of God's sovereignty, of his omniscience, of his omnipotence, because he allows innocent people to suffer. The most popular view of this has come from an American rabbi. His name is Harold Kushner, and he wrote one of the most famous books on suffering. It sells all across the board in bookstores across the nation right now. When bad things happen to good people. What do we do when bad things happen to good people? Harold Kushner was a rabbi who lost his son. His son died, and he simply couldn't deal with a faith that had a God that was all-powerful. Instead, he concluded that God could not prevent his son's death. If he could, he wouldn't have allowed it. And he says this in his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. I can worship a God who hates suffering but cannot eliminate it more easily then I can worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die. That book has sold over 500,000 copies in its hardback form, well over 1 million in its paperback form. Apparently, Rabbi Kushner has hit a nerve with the American people. Why don't you look down at verse 19? For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and you are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. And so God tells us to endure suffering. But the first thing you want you to see in this text is sometimes people suffer innocently. It is very possible to suffer unjustly. Peter says this in this very text. Some people suffer unjustly. It happens all the time. And so the caution right away when we read these verses is watch out for the pat answers. Watch out for becoming Job's friends. There must be something wrong with you in your life that you are having to endure this. Look out for the sin that's in your own heart. But did you catch the repetition in these two verses? 3 times there was this one main verb that is repeated in 2 verses. For this is a good and gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows. For what credit is it if when you sin you're beaten for it, you endure? At the end of verse 20, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. And endure is a compound word in the Greek. It's made up of 2 words. The verb, the main verb, is to carry a heavy burden. But it's an added prefix along to it that makes it even stronger. And what this means when Peter writes this is he says, it's very possible that you will have to remain under a very heavy burden for a long period of time. In fact, as a Christian, it's very possible to have to do that over a lengthy period of time. And I don't know what you guys are suffering through right now in your life. They say there's 2 people in this world, those who have either just gone through an avenue of suffering or those who are going through it right now. But sometimes God calls us to remain under a heavy burden for a very long time. Romans 5:5. Rejoice in suffering, because suffering produces proven character. Proven character produces endurance. Endurance produces hope. But everything in these 2 verses comes back to this tiny little phrase in verse 19. In the ESV, it says, mindful of God. A lot of your translations will say, conscience of God. It's really hard to translate. It's probably the most difficult grammatical, syntactical phrase in the verses that we're talking about this morning. The sense is not, when you are suffering, bring God into your thoughts. That's not what Peter is saying. One commentator puts it this way. He says, it's more likely that of God, mindful of God, conscious of God, describes the character of the conscious. And Peter is not saying to endure suffering because there is no other option. He is not saying to endure suffering to stay optimistic in your endurance. He is saying to endure suffering because you know that it will ultimately please God. Stay under, be mindful of God, be mindful that this is an opportunity where you can ultimately please God. So why is God pleased, or how is God pleased through suffering? And we talk a lot about C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis endured a ton of suffering in his life. He suffered a lot when he was a child. He lost his mother at a very early age. He lost his wife very early on in his marriage. And he writes, the greatness of C.S. Lewis is his thoughts on the goodness of God through pain and suffering. He writes A Problem of Pain, A Grief Observed. They're 2 of his best books. And in those books, here's what he says. He says, am I just a man who won't accept the fact that there's nothing we can do with suffering except to suffer it? Who thinks there's some device, if only I could find it, which would make pain not pain? Lewis says it doesn't really matter if you grip the dentist chair or you let your hands lie in your lap. The drill drills on. In suffering, you realize that God cannot be used as a road. If you are approaching him not as the goal, but as a road, not as the end, but as a means to an end, you're really not approaching him at all. And C.S. Lewis says in suffering, you realize one main thing is you can't come to God on your own terms. And you can't come to God for the benefits of coming to God, because the benefits that we think exists about coming to God, when we deal with pain and suffering, really don't always surface as benefits when you're in the heat of suffering. He says this, he says, "Bridge tellers tell me that there must be some money in the game or else people won't take it seriously. Apparently, it's like that with God. You will never discover how serious your faith is until the stakes are raised horribly high. Until you found that you are not playing for counters or sixpences, but for every penny you have in the world. Nothing less will shake a man out of his merely verbal thinking, his merely notional beliefs about God. He has to be knocked silly before he comes to his senses. And only torture, only suffering will ultimately bring out the truth." Tim Keller says, "Suffering removes the blinders. It does not make us so much helpless and out of control as it shows us that we have always been vulnerable and completely dependent on God." So how do we improve during suffering and not abandon our faith? We look into our own hearts and we realize that not only are we not in control, we never had control in the first place. Number two, we realize that we have a good and a gracious God who is sustaining us before suffering, through suffering, and after suffering. So when we come across suffering, we endure, we don't avert. We improve, we don't abandon our theology and our understanding of who God is. Number three, we press in, we don't push away. Look at verse 21. Verse 21 says, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself," and that's a really key phrase there in verse 23, "entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He bore our sins himself on his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but now you've returned to the shepherd and to the overseer of your souls." And whenever you get to high Christological passages like this, one of my favorite pastors is Tommy Nelson. He said, "You don't try to teach or preach these passages. You just read them, and you let them sink in." This is a high Christology and a high passage on the truth of the cross. Second, there are some obvious items in this passage that really make it stand out, that give us the greatest meaning. Verse 21 says that Christ suffered for you. And that means that Christ suffered for you. He suffered instead of you. He suffered in the place of you. Instead of us rightfully suffering, Jesus wrongfully suffered on our behalf. Theologians term this the substitutionary death, or the substitutionary view of the atonement. And it is a strong view of the atonement. John Stott has perhaps the greatest thought on the substitutionary death of Christ. And here's what he says: "The essence of sin is we human beings substituting ourselves for God, while the essence of salvation is God substituting himself for us. We put ourselves where only God deserves to be, and he puts himself where we deserve to be." Another very obvious phrase from verse 21 is that Christ left us an example. And this is a highly technical word. When he says Christ left us an example, that word for example describes, it's kind of like, I've got a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 9-year-old at our house. And we teach our kids the alphabet, how to write their letters. And when we teach our kids how to write the letters, they take out this book that you can write with a dry erase marker on it. And you just trace the letters on it. You learn how to write your A, how you should write it, your B, your C, and all these things. This is the same word that Christ left us an example. He left us an outline to follow. We trace the footsteps of Jesus in our suffering. But to draw it all to a conclusion, I want to just jump right to verse 25. Peter ends with a picture of a shepherd in his sheep. And this is a great place to end a passage on suffering. Spurgeon reminds us, gives us a great warning in the church. He says, "A time will come when instead of shepherds feeding the sheep in the church, we will have clowns entertaining the goats." Right? But shepherds feed the sheep. And so he ends with this term on shepherd and sheep. And he says that one of the main tasks of the shepherd, one of the main tasks of the good shepherd, is to protect the sheep. But no pastor and no good shepherd will protect the sheep completely from suffering. We can't eliminate suffering in your life. It's said the job of a pastor is to comfort the afflicted, but afflict those who are comfortable. This is part of our responsibility, but our job as pastors, and as God's job as the Good Shepherd, is to protect you through suffering, not to avoid it and to go around it. Oswald Chambers says, suffering will either pull you closer to God or push you away from Him. At no point in your life is worship more important than when you suffer. Jared Wilson says, the closer we are to the shepherd, the safer we are from the wolves. And so this is our job, to shepherd the sheep. As we close this passage, just want to give two words of application, and we will be done. There's nothing more certain in life that you will suffer. Our natural instinct, typically when we suffer, is to ask why. Everybody asks, why is this happening? Why is this instance of suffering, why has this pain been given to me, been given to this person? Why is it happening now? Why is it happening in this way? How long are we going to suffer for? And there are two basic ways that people truly do respond to suffering. Number one is the moralistic way. A moralist will respond to suffering just like Job's three friends. He'll say, man, I must have to go to church more, or I must have to pray more often because this suffering is too difficult for me to endure, and I don't want to have to go through anything like it ever again. And so maybe if I pray more or go to church more, maybe I just need more faith. Maybe that's the way that I can endure suffering. That's one way, is the moralist's approach to suffering. Another way is the secularists' approach to suffering. And the secularists don't say moralism is the right answer. The secularists will actually say that cynicism is the right answer. See, this proves that there is no God. If there is a God, He's certainly incompetent or He is impotent, because He's not powerful enough to remove this suffering from my life, or He's not smart enough to figure out how to orchestrate the world in a way that wouldn't allow us to suffer as human beings. And both responses are incredibly wrong, but both responses share one characteristic when you get into it. Both responses have an innate desire for us to be in control of our lives. A moralist will say, I got to get in control of this thing. So I'm going to go to church more, and I'm going to pray more, and I'm going to have more faith, and I'm going to do more service projects, and I'm going to be a better Christian. A cynical person says, God must be impotent. He must be incompetent. So you know what? I'm going to make my own God, and I'm not going to bow to any God, especially not the God of the Bible that Christians proclaim. And so I want you to do two things as we think about applying this passage at the end of 1 Peter chapter 2. And it's just two very simple admonitions. Number one, as through our suffering, I want us all to look in. I want us all to look inside of ourselves and look at our own hearts. Number two, I want us all to look up to the sovereignty of God and to a God who is ultimately in control of all things. Number one is to look in. Suffering like no other thing on the planet, demands that you stop where you are in life and you do a little introspection on your own life. You realize that you've been hanging on to some things way too tightly. You realize who you are in sight of things that are outside of your control. Suffering should cause you to look in and to be transformed about your attitude concerning the self. Suffering humbles us. There's no way that suffering cannot humble you. It shows you that God is God and you are not. It shows us how fragile we are. And it removes the thought that we can truly rule over our own lives. Because if any of us are sitting on the throne of our own hearts, all of us would say, suffering, I don't want a piece of it. We want control. And Satan's main task in suffering is to get you to think about this thought that you have been manipulating or exploiting God the whole time in your Christian life. Have you been serving God because He's giving you the blessings, or have you been serving God simply for the sake of serving God in His beauty and His majesty? Remember Job? Satan asked this very question to God in the heavenly of heavenly places. Does Job serve God for nothing? Does Job love you? Does he worship you when you take all the blessings away? If you take everything away from Job if you take away his family, his livelihood, his possessions, will he still serve you? Is he still going to love you? And it was, listen, this is the same question that Adam and Eve got in the garden in Genesis 3. The serpent comes to the woman at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and says, did God really say? I think God knows in the day of you eat of it, you will be like God, and you will know good and evil. You will actually have some sense of control over your own life. One of the reasons that we suffer, we go through difficult times that get to the root of us and they bother us so much, is because we believe the lies of Satan, right? And so Keller says this, Satan said to God about us, this is the test case of Job, Satan said to God about us, they don't really love you, but God resisted. But when Satan said to us about God, he doesn't really love you, we believed it. Hook, line, and sinker in the garden. In suffering, we see the worst in ourselves. Weak faith, anxiety, bitterness, resentment, loss of control. We see we've been holding on to things way too tight. Suffering will test your connection to God more than anything else. And so number one, the first thing we do in suffering is we look in. Do we have a God that we've created, or do we have a God who created us? Number two, when dealing with suffering, we look up. And one of the hardest aspects of suffering is being able to see beyond it. Especially some of us will finish our lives in suffering. When you're going through the storms of life, it tends to be very much step by step, day by day. It's very hard to get to the end chapters and be able to think back of what God has been doing this whole time. We don't know the whys of the suffering, and we certainly ask a lot like, oh Lord, how long? This is the cry of Habakkuk. How long are we going to go through this suffering? We are confined to the present. We have no power to control it, and we have no ability to see past it. God has written a grand story, a redemptive story over all of our lives. But right now, we're in the middle of that story. We know the beginning of the story, and in fact, we truly know the end of the story, but sometimes in our own lives, it's difficult to see what our end is going to be, how our story is going to end redemptively. Remember Joseph and all the years of suffering that he had in the book of Genesis? Genesis 50, verse 20, finally, the last chapter of Genesis, it says, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. He finally got to that last chapter and he was able to look back. Remember Romans 8:28, for God causes all things to work for good to everybody on the planet? No, to those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Look back at verse 23, 1 Peter. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to one who judges justly. He kept entrusting himself. Literally, he gave himself over to the author of his story. And he knew that this was going to work out for his good. Jerry Sitzer was a college professor who lost 3 generations in his family in one fell swoop. He lost his mother, his wife, and a daughter in one horrific accident, all in the span of about 10 minutes. And he wrote about it in a book called Grace Revealed. It is hands down the greatest book that I have ever read on suffering and dealing with mourning and people that go through loss. It's Gary Sitzer. It's called A Grace Revealed. And he talks about story. The way to deal with suffering is to have a bigger picture of God's redemptive story that he has over all of our lives. And he says this. He says, being inside a story is a very different experience from rising above it. Living a story is very different from reading it. But we have no choice but let the mystery of it unfold, which requires faith. We must choose to believe that God is working redemption when nothing in this life assures us that he really is. Evelyn Underhill says, if God were small enough to be understood, he wouldn't be big enough to be worshipped. How are you going to endure suffering when you come across it in your lifetime? Are you going to adopt the Eastern view of suffering? Are you going to adopt the common ancient philosophies in the West that we have of suffering? Or are you going to endure suffering instead of averting it? Are you going to improve your theology instead of abandoning it? Are you going to push against God instead of pulling away from him. Let's pray this morning. Father in heaven, just thank you so much that the suffering that we're going to experience in our life, that the suffering that we have to endure will be nothing compared to the suffering you endured on the cross. I thank you for the great truth that you took on the wrath of God on our behalf, and you substituted yourself on the cross in our place, and you took on our sin. You paid the price for us that we deserved, and you took the penalty that you did not deserve. And in doing that, you paid the penalty for our sin. And so we thank you that you went to the cross on our behalf. And Lord, I pray as we approach these instances of suffering, just give us an encouragement to endure through those times, to not look for the way out, but to look for who you are, what you are doing in our lives as we work through it. And we trust that you are writing a redemptive story, and we know the end of it. We certainly know the beginning, what got us into this mess in the first place. We pray that you would draw us to the hope that we know is ultimately at the end. I thank you for our chance to gather together. Thank you for our pastors, Jason, the elders at Center Point, including Bill, and being able to come together and worship together as a church community. I pray that we'd be able to increase those things in the days to come and just realize the important things in life, and certainly the important things in Whitewater, Kansas, that we all worship a God who has died for us on a cross through his Son, Jesus Christ, and that we might do that together. We pray all these things to you, Father, through the Son and by the Spirit, for you three are the one true God, and there is no God besides you. Amen.